Ladies and gentlemen, dear friend, welcome to the House of Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. I would like to welcome you. I'd like to call this to order. This is number 70 of the House of Commons, pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, April 17, 2023. We're studying Bill C-35, an Act to amend the Investment of Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. With us today to study Bill C-34, we have a number of witnesses here. I'd like to welcome you to being here in person and virtually for this important study. As an individual, Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow, Centre of Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad, Macdonald-Laurier Institute, welcome. From the C.D. Howe Institute, Daniel Schwanen, Vice President Research by video conference, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. You'll please correct me if that's the case. From the Center for International Governance Innovation, Dan Cyriac, Senior Fellow, as well as Gen Majoran, also here by video conference, Robert Mezelin, and from the Council of Canadian Innovators, Mr. Jim Basile, Chair. Thank you very much for being here with us as well. And finally, from the Canadian Bar Association, Sandy Walker, Chair, Competition Law and Foreign Investment Review Section, with Michael Caldecott, Chair, Foreign Investment Review Committee, Competition Law and Foreign Investment Review Section, who are also joining us here in Ottawa in person. So thank you to all of you for your attendance. And since we have a very busy panel today, we're going to try to limit your testimony to 5 minutes each. We'll begin with Mr. Burton. The floor is yours, Mr. Burton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My area of expertise is China's domestic politics and China's foreign policy. So with that in mind, I'd like to pick up on 2 points raised by Minister Champagne when he appeared before this committee last week. And they are that the minister said that henceforth state-owned companies' investments in Canada will be approved only in exceptional circumstances. And secondly, he told you that last November, after a national security review, based on intelligence that he had received, Minister Champagne ordered 3 Chinese resource companies to sell their interests in Canadian critical mineral firms, lithium. But the fact is that all Chinese global enterprises are fully integrated into the PRC party, state, corporate, military, and security apparatus because, as Party General Secretary Xi Jinping has put it, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. There are no Chinese industrial enterprises existing independently from China's party state. Huawei, for example, does not self-identify as a Chinese state-owned enterprise, but like all PRC institutions, its org chart suggests that Huawei's Chinese Communist Party branch takes precedent over the Huawei Board of Directors in corporate decision-making. Huawei's corporate purpose is to compete prudently in foreign markets and make money, but as the Government of Canada determined in banning Huawei's participation in the 5G software and hardware, Huawei's raison d'etre is not just about economic profitability, but to serve other PRC regime geostrategic purposes that threaten Canada's national security as well. Chinese law requires that all companies and individuals cooperate with their intelligence establishment and hide that cooperation. That, combined with the Chinese regime's unrelenting cyber and human source spying on our parliament, political parties, government departments, universities, and businesses, is reason enough to conclude that foreign investment from China must be subject to the most stringent national security test, regardless of what sector or industry the proposed investment may target. For example, China's so-called police stations are overseen by Chinese diplomats in Canada to coordinate Chinese Communist Party United Front Work Department operations to menace and harass Canadian Uyghurs and Tibetans and human rights activists, subvert Canadian officials, facilitate Chinese Ministry of State Security espionage operations, hand out money for election interference, and so on. If these police station operations are inconvenienced by an RCMP vehicle being parked outside the station, whether it's in Markham or Richmond or Montreal or wherever. It is easy for the Chinese authorities to simply inform a Chinese business invested in Canada that the police station will relocate to your premises, and please issue fake letters of invitation to facilitate false visa applications for Chinese police or People's Liberation Army military researchers to enter Canada on false pretenses for covert or gray zone operations to transfer dual-use technologies to the Chinese regime. We have many examples of this, including evidence given by Canadian government immigration officials in this regard. Any intellectual property that any Chinese concern becomes privy to through its foreign investment in a Canadian partner is, as a matter of course, going to be covertly transferred through Chinese Communist Party channels to whatever elements of China's Communist Party regime can apply the Canadian proprietary technology or manufacturing process to further China's overall diverse regime interests. We have many examples of this, too. Finally, I urge a more coordinated approach to all this. Australia's Foreign Investment Reform, entitled Protecting Australia's National Security Act of 2020, was enacted to follow on Australia's Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act of 2018. I should point out that implementing this latter act, the Foreign Influence Registry, did not instigate any rise of anti-Asian racism in Australia. I strongly recommend to this committee that Canada look carefully to Australia's strengthening of laws against covert foreign influencing and espionage, curbs on proxy foreign donations to political parties, and better controls over the security of critical infrastructure. Modeling on Australian legislation could allow Canada to make our legislative improvements in a much shorter time frame. The longer we delay, the worse it gets. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. We'll now move to Mr. Schwanen for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've prepared my remarks in English, but I'll be happy to answer in French to any questions if so desired.
OECD scrutiny of foreign direct investment or FDI on security grounds has picked up quite a bit since 2015, as firms controlled by foreign governments that are not necessarily friendly have used FDI on the one hand to gain access to critical supply chain components or to critical technologies or infrastructure, while on the other hand clearly exhibiting signs of not treating these investments or their host countries on normal commercial terms, and even introducing coercive or hostile aspects to the relationship of the kind that Mr. Burton described. So it's not foreign ownership per se, but the combination of these two factors that is alarming, and the proposed amendments are also part of a global trend. Again, the example of Australia. Studies that we published over the years have recommended simplifying and bringing more transparency and more openness to the screening of those foreign investments in Canada, for which there are no reasons to think that they would not be undertaken for legitimate commercial reasons following Canadian laws and so on, while at the same time exercising a sharper scrutiny of investments posing potential security threats. We can do both, and the research that I just mentioned support the current direction in this bill. I want to make that support clear because the rest of my comments concern the relationship between this bill and Canada's competitiveness in attracting FDI. Canada has had a decent year in 2022 in terms of attracting or retaining FDI, as reported just a couple of days ago by Statistics Canada. Nevertheless, the OECD continues to rank Canada's FDI policies as more restrictive than those of partners who also happen to be competitors for investments, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia. And so as we strengthen these security provisions in the Investment Canada Act, we don't want to unnecessarily add to these barriers by sacrificing predictability and transparency of criteria for potential foreign investors when this predictability of transparency can be provided consistent with ensuring the security and safety of Canadians. Since addressing economic security threats is a major focus of this bill, for example, I would say that to be predictable and transparent, Canada needs to be coherent across government about what these economic threats are and how they can be addressed by adding scrutiny, adding criteria for scrutinizing foreign investment. As just one example, Canada is still developing its national supply chain strategy, which presumably will address security of critical supplies. So which sectors come under particular scrutiny here under the ICA should be consistent with that strategy, just as Canada's decision of which investors will come under particular rules or scrutiny should be informed by the Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is a matter of coherence and clarity for foreign investors. Naturally, what we might want to, at any given point, consider certain investments in certain sectors has to be left to regulations. It has to be flexible. But I hope that the legislation will require that these regulations be based on a clear rationale and require the government to provide guidance regarding their interpretation, for example, in the form of updated guidelines on the National Security Review of Investments. With respect to the bill's information sharing provisions, they will help align our FDI policies with those of close partners. This is a good thing in an era of friendshoring and will help us understand and anticipate threats better, especially assuming that our partners reciprocate with information sharing. The ability provided in the proposed amendments for the investor and the government to discuss mitigating actions an investor might take to make its plan conform with Canada's security needs, was also anticipated in our 2015 paper, and it is to be applauded. Of course, for that mechanism to be effective, investors need to know the elements that would make such an undertaking acceptable in the government's eyes, without the government divulging national security secrets. Here again, clarity of criteria and guidance are crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now cede the floor to the Center for International Governance Innovation. So, Mr. Cyrulnik.
Thank you very much, Chair and honorable members, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I am with CIGI as a senior fellow, and where I write on the digital economy and innovation. I want to make several remarks, largely in connection to how well the reforms of the Investment Canada Act respond to the digital transformation. So the first comment is that in the innovation economy, when a company wants to acquire a new capability, it acquires a company that has successfully mastered that particular function, and then it absorbs it. So the significance of the company may not be its market cap, but its role in the ecosystem of innovation and how that actually amplifies or expands a company's own palette of products and capabilities. And how that technology which is acquiring combines with others to produce world-class applications. So what matters in the innovation economy is not the size threshold so much as the connectedness threshold. And I don't see that concept in the present construction of the reforms. Second point is that the Act is premised on the ability to designate prescribed sectors. The words supply chain or value chain do not appear, as far as I can tell, in the Act. However, the geopolitical background or battleground in the technology war today is not in sectors, but in supply chains. And economic security today is based on capture of the valuable parts of value chains. Now, some of you may be familiar with the SMILE curve of innovation, where basically the value captured, where you have lots of value, is at the initial stage of the production process, which in the data-driven and knowledge-based economy is actually with capturing patents, intellectual property, and data. And then in the market end, where you have branding, okay? In the middle part of the curve, which is the low-value capture part, that's where you do the data processing, the development of processes and so forth. And that is where we are now in Canada concentrated. We are not capturing the high ends of the value chain. And so the question for us as we move forward in framing an Investment Canada Act that is going to work for Canada is how to capture the high ends of that curve. And I don't see that as well in the Act right now. Third point is that data is the essential capital asset of the modern knowledge-based and data-driven economy. Its value is protean and depends on the application. So what's valuable to one person may not be valuable to another. So this is one of the least well understood areas of valuation of the market economy. Back in the 1990s, Robert Solow famously said that the computer revolution is everywhere but in the economic statistics. Today, data is everywhere but in the economic and trade statistics. We're not seeing it, but we do know that it is very, very powerful, very, very important. And so a company may be otherwise valueless. Its market cap may be minimal, but the data that it possesses may be extraordinarily valuable, and from a national security concern may be of great concern to Canada. So it's not easy to see how the Investment Canada captures this particular reality. The fourth point is that the Draft Act is based on whether an entity has a place of operations, employees, or assets in Canada. Prior to the digital transformation, the combination of export controls and investment screening effectively covered the waterfront to safeguard our national security concerns with regard to the way the economy functions. However, with the digital transformation, it is now possible for companies to operate in Canada on a virtual basis. This distinction is recognized in the OECD G20 inclusive framework, where we actually have agreed on how to tax the operations of foreign multinationals that are operating with significant presence in Canada, but on a virtual basis. Now, those companies may be capturing data and may be influencing our society just as much on a virtual basis as any company with a physical presence here, and yet there is no way to screen that presence at the moment. If we were to generalize what we are doing today with the Investment Canada Act, we would be talking about an Operations in Canada Act. And one part of that act would be the physical operations, which we call investment. Another part of it would be the virtual presence. And we don't have that distinction yet, so we are not, I think, responding adequately yet to the digital transformation. The fifth and final point is that, in my view, the greatest threat to our national security at the moment is data-driven, micro-targeted personal messaging that drives divisiveness. The technical notes to GPT-4, the most powerful large language model recently released by OpenAI, comments on how easy it is to get factions to hate each other. Okay, and it's very easy also to tweak an algorithm from do no harm to maximize harm. And this has been proven in trials. So the question is, how do we actually address that? The Investment Canada Act has a section which deals with cultural industries. Our culture is being transformed by the presence of this inflow of information and disinformation, and without any referendum on how to actually manage this. So I would say our cultural institutions are in the attention business, and they are not, our existing ones are not competing well. And we don't have a way right now to deal with that. And the Investment Canada Act while it purports to address this issue, it does not. So I will leave it there.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Syriac.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I'll turn it over to Mr. Jim Bazzi, the Canadian Council of Innovation.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I am Jim Balsillie, Chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators. In the modern, knowledge-based and data-driven economy, the sources of prosperity and the vectors of risk have changed. Updating the Investment Canada Act is a critical strategic step that can advance Canada's prosperity and security. Unfortunately, the proposed amendments are not sufficient to make the ICA fit for those objectives. The understanding of foreign direct investment that informs the updated document is based on the tangible production economy. Today's economy is knowledge-based and data-driven. In such an economy, FDI is extractive, where technology, knowledge and data assets, senior executive personnel, tax base, and wealth effects can easily flow out of countries that receive foreign investments. Prosperity and security risks do not scale with size and type of buyer, but with the nature of economic and security spillovers. Specifically, economic and security risks should not be analyzed separately. IP and data have multi-sided features that interrelate, giving rise to so-called dual-use technology that has both economic and national security value. Any assessment of risk and net benefit needs to include the economic and security value of assets as an integrated whole alongside the changed nature of spillovers in the economy of intangibles. Second, the list of strategic technologies and a set of risk factors is incomplete and needs to mirror those of our allies, particularly the United States. ICA needs to be regularly updated to properly guide an informed assessment of a given investment in Canada. IP and data have strong public good characteristics, so decisions made by businesses do not price the associated spillovers into contractual agreements. Data in particular has pervasive dual-use characteristics with implications not just on the security of our nation's infrastructure, like transportation, telecommunications, energy, and finance, but also across all economic sectors and areas of human interaction, including democracy. My recommendations: 1, broaden the focus of any review to include a more appropriate lens of critical strategic technologies, which would allow for the assessment of university partnerships, licenses, and transactions of valuable IP and data. If assets are deemed critical to Canada's prosperity and security, then the ICA needs to ensure they remain in our control, regardless of the type of foreign counterparty or nature of commercial relationship. Number 2, give legislative powers to the federal government, similar to those legislated in Australia, to unwind any prior investment, university partnership, joint venture, or merger or acquisition. 3, build capacity inside the federal government for governance of today's economy. Recent FDI initiatives, such as the Sidewalk Toronto project, continued university partnerships with Huawei, and the Invest in Canada agency marketing strategies demonstrate that Canada's policy-making apparatus is not just rooted in the traditional production economy of yesterday, but is decades behind the realities of the contemporary economy. 4th, create a transparent expert entity akin to CFIUS to implement and oversee all FDI regulations and strategies for the federal government, akin to the coherent and coordinated approach Professor Burton just advocated for. The strategic nature of IP and data have restructured the composition of markets by reconfiguring how an economy extracts benefit from technology and introduces new risks. This is why advanced economies and our allies have made significant steps to develop modern investment screening systems and continue to make dynamic updates, expanding the powers of foreign investment review necessary to defend valuable national interests. Canada must do the same if it wants to defend critical infrastructure and assets vital to our prosperity, security, and sovereignty. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Madame.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Walker from the Canadian Bar Association.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee. My name is Sandy Walker, and I'm the chair of the Competition Law and Foreign Investment Review section of the Canadian Bar Association, and I'm a partner with the law firm of Dentons Canada. Thank you for inviting the CBA to discuss the proposed amendments to the Investment Canada Act. Les principaux objectifs de
The main objectives are the improvement of the law and the administration of justice. And it is within this objective, and that is why we are here today.
Michael Caldecott, chair of the Foreign Investment Committee of the section. Michael is a partner at the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault. At the outset, the CBA recognizes both the importance of foreign investment to the Canadian economy and the importance of national security review of foreign investments in protecting Canada's national security. Today, we offer our views on how the bill can be improved to ensure its effective implementation without imposing unnecessary burdens on foreign investors and the government. The bill establishes mandatory pre-closing notification for acquisitions involving targets in prescribed business activities. Such transactions could not close until clearance has been received. To ensure predictability, it is critical that the new regime not come into effect until crucial terms, such as prescribed business activities, have been defined. These definitions are essential to determine whether a pre-closing filing is required, and as a result should be defined either in the law itself or, if not, the bill should require regulations to define those terms. Second, if these definitions are not in the legislation, the draft regulation should be prepared in parallel with Bill C-34, or the amendment should come into force only after the regulations have been finalized. Third, the bill will capture acquisitions of non-controlling interests in a foreign entity with a Canadian subsidiary, even if the target has very limited operations in Canada. In these cases, national security concerns are unlikely to arise. We therefore recommend exempting these indirect acquisitions where revenues and/or assets in Canada are under a de minimis level. Fourth, to address transactions in progress when the amendments come into force, we recommend that the new regime become effective 90 days after the bill receives royal assent. I will now ask my colleague Mike Caldicott to discuss the other points.
Thank you, Sandy. Our second point is that the Investment Review Division, IRD, will need to have adequate resources to administer the new notification regime. The government must be able to process notifications quickly to determine their completeness because national security review timelines run from a filing certification date and closing cannot occur until this timeline has expired. IRD is currently unable to make certification decisions promptly. They are often issued at least a month or more after notification. With an increase in the number of filings, the timing of certification will become even more problematic and could significantly delay the closing of transactions, negatively affecting the credibility of the government within Canadian and international business communities. We recommend the government be required to assess a filing's completeness within 3 business days and to ensure that IRD has adequate resources to achieve this time limit. The third point is the introduction of interim measures. The bill allows the minister to prohibit all forms of transaction planning activity, including those that are legitimate to undertake on a post-signing, pre-closing basis. We believe the minister should only have such an extraordinary unsupervised power for a limited time, such as 30 days. To extend the interim prohibition, the minister should be required to apply for a court order with notice to the affected parties. The bill also gives the minister the power to accept mitigation measures as conditions of approval. In the interest of transparency, we believe the minister should periodically publish aggregated and anonymized guidance indicating the types of mitigation accepted. In closing, the bill gives the government greater ability to assert national security privilege during the judicial review of a national security order. This raises serious concerns regarding the ability of investors to effectively exercise the right to seek judicial review. We have proposed some options to address this imbalance and achieve a better, fairer decision-making process. Thank you again for the opportunity to present today. We look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses today, and we'll start the discussion with Mr. Perkins for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming. I'd like to begin perhaps with some questions to Dr. Barton, if I could, or Burton. In 2017, the previous Minister of Industry failed to request a full national security review of the acquisition of BC-based telecommunications company Norsat International and its subsidiary Sinclair Technologies, both telecommunications companies in Canada, by China-based Hytera, which is partially owned by the Chinese government. Manitoba-based Tanco, better known as Tanco Mine, Canada's only producing lithium mine, was purchased by Chinese company Cinnamine in 2019. Again, it was approved by the government with no national security review. It also produces, in addition to all of the lithium it produces going to China, it also produces over 65% of the world's cesium, which is used in drilling applications, and also is Canada's largest deposit of tantalum, if I pronounce that right, used in electronics. In January 2022, the Minister Champagne failed to follow his own guidelines when he fast-tracked the takeover of the Canadian lithium company Neo Lithium Corp by Chinese state-owned Zijin Mining without a national security review. It appears to me that the Act as it states right now is totally inadequate in dealing with national security reviews and the minister's voluntary ability to do it. And my understanding is that in this bill, it does nothing to change the threshold, which right now is $415 million. So anything that a state-owned enterprise also under $415 million is not subject to any jurisdiction or scrutiny by the minister. So is there anything in this bill that changes the requirement or the request by the Industry Committee in its report in 2021 that the review by any state-owned enterprise the limit be $0 in order to ensure our national security reviews are done?
Well, I did hear Mr. Champagne say that there would not be a threshold for national security. I mean, for economic damage to Canada, that apparently does
Not
still.
in the bill, though, and previous ministers, and he won't always be there, previous ministers have not invoked the powers they have, and there's nothing in this bill that guarantees any current or future minister will, is there?
Yes, I quite agree. I'm distressed by these examples that you gave, and we came pretty damn close to giving Aecon Construction to China. So, you know, there have been so many examples of this, puzzling that we don't seem to understand the seriousness of China's security threat to Canada, and time after time make these decisions or even reversal of Harper Cabinet decision with regard to Chinese state acquisition. So, you know, and I agree with the Canadian Bar Association that we need adequate resources for notification, but for a different reason from what they say. They want it to be done speedier. I understand that, but I think we just need a lot more expertise in government to be informing these decisions. And I think that we really have to be much more questioning why, time and time again, when there are serious allegations of malfeasance by China-connected entities, that we seem to put those reports into the back of a drawer and don't act on them. You know, I'm not getting particularly partisan political about this. I just want to know what the reasons were for these decisions that were not taken according to the CSIS reports.
Recently in the news, we've all been witnessing Glencore's attempts at a hostile takeover of Canada's largest last remaining miner, Teck Resources. And Glencore was fined $1.1 billion in the United States last year for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States, basically bribery and corruption around the world in their mining operations, which they use as a cost of doing business. Canada has fined one of their subsidiaries $28.5 million for misleading investors. The United Kingdom fined them almost $500 million Canadian for the same issues around corruption and bribery in Africa. Should this Act contain an automatic provision, review, and consideration in the Act about companies that have been either convicted of bribery and corruption charges and breaching those laws around the world, or even done a settlement out of that process in order to get away from those charges?
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing issue as well. I did publish a piece in the Globe and Mail on Tuesday with regard to the China Investment Corporation's lack of support for Teck with regard to the hostile takeover by Glencore. But, you know, we have been seeing this kind of thing for quite a long time. And I think that, you know, in terms of our previous policy of allowing Chinese investor immigrants, for example, to come to Canada, the basis for assessment was whether the Chinese person who wants to invest in Canada had behaved in a way that that maintained the standards of China in terms of how much income tax they evaded and how much bribery they paid, on the assumption that if they were following the norms of China, they would follow the norms of Canada. The program was eventually canceled because that just doesn't work. You can't expect a company to behave morally in Canada when they've been behaving atrociously in foreign nations. That's my opinion as a non-expert on this subject.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Bynen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to direct my first question to either Ms. Walker or Mr. Caldecott. The Bar Association's brief in April 2023, you encourage the government to ensure that amendments to the proposed Bill C-34 and the regulations and the guidelines accompanying the new mandatory pre-closing regime are clear and do not pose unnecessary requirements or burdens. How do you suggest the government strike the required balance between the protection of Canada's national security interest and the importance of allowing foreign investment in Canada?
I think so. One way that the Act can address the proper balance is to ensure that you're capturing the right transactions in the mandatory pre-notification procedure. And that requires that when you define prescribed business activities, you're focusing in on those areas that those transactions, so acquisitions of businesses in sectors who are involved in certain activities that raise the most national security concerns. Currently, we have national security guidelines. They have an annex that includes a list of factors. It's like 10 long. They're very, very broad. They don't give a lot of guidance. So they might just say biotechnology, quantum computing. I don't have the list in front of me, but it is extremely broad, gives very little guidance. So another source of guidance might be looking at what other jurisdictions have done. The NSIA in the UK has quite a long description of the types of transactions that raise national security risks. The CFIUS has a lot of information describing the types of sectors and activities that create national security risks. So that's one angle.
The Bar Association also, in their brief to committee, noted that the terms such as material, non-public technical information, and material assets, which are essential parts of the criteria for identifying as to whether or not a pre-closure filing is required, are ambiguous. These terms may be defined by regulation. Now, why do you feel, or how do you feel that they should be defined? In the legislation itself, in the Act? Or by regulation? What are your concerns with respect to that?
So on the issue of material non-public technical information, we do have a precedent in the United States, and what we've seen in the reform to the CFIUS program, which is under the FIRMA Act, that term has been defined relatively narrowly and precisely. I think the Canadian Bar Association supports that definition in that it provides a degree of certainty as to what is captured by it. The additional sort of concern, I think, that the Bar Association identified was when this term was going to be set, whether that would be in the legislation or in regulation. And given there is uncertainty at the moment as to when regulations will be prepared and published, it seemed to us that it was important that that term was defined in the Act itself. The final point on that is just to mention that this term is not, unlike the prescribed business activities, which may legitimately be an evolving list of sectors that evolves over time as different sectors become more or less sensitive, material, non-public, technical information may well be in the same category as that, but certainly it is an easier definition to reach and therefore perhaps more conducive to being included in the Act rather than regulations that subsequently could evolve.
So the benefit of regulations would be the flexibility in how they can be modified. And wouldn't you see that as an important characteristic, particularly when we see such change in the industry and technology? Is that not the flexibility that you'd want to see in the Act?
I do think that regulations do offer greater flexibility than the Act. They're much easier to add on to or subtract from. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My next question is to Mr. Shuriak. Very interesting, the fact that value now could now exist in non-existent material things. How do you propose that regulations would address the concern that you have, and that is that real value and risk lies in data and value chain and supply chains? How would you propose we tighten up the legislation to address that more closely, as you've suggested?
That is the billion-dollar question facing us all today. We can at least, first of all, recognize the fact that data itself is a very valuable asset, and that it has no specific value at the same time. And monetary value, you can't necessarily put a figure on this. We see it indirectly in the market cap of companies that have got very limited amounts of physical assets, but have a very, very large market cap, and they don't even have intangible assets in the form of intellectual property, patents and so forth, that account for most of it. So we know that there's an awful lot of value out there, and we also see in market transactions an acquisition which will be described as a pure data play. So a company which may be not making very much money whatsoever may transact for billions of dollars simply because of the data it has. So how do you deal with that? I think the first thing is that to recognize that companies disclose that they have data, and that we apply a threshold on the amount of data, perhaps not on the value of it, and a description of the data that as to whether or not it would have potential national security concerns, and also as to how that data connects with other forms of data that we may have in the Canadian ecosystem. So it's a question of getting a new terminology about sort of the connectedness of companies. And there has been work on that, by the way, done by Ari Van Ash in Montreal, where he's actually put together charts which show how companies connect. But we're at very, very early stages in terms of understanding this. So in the first instance, what I would suggest is that we actually have a separate criterion for data where it is disclosed and described, and there would be a consideration as to whether or not that amount of data is something which is material and of concern to Canada.
Could you send us the reference that you had? Could you submit that to the committee for our review?
I would be pleased to.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time.
You're out of time, Mr. Van Bynen. Thank you. We'll now turn to Monsieur Lemire pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me begin with Mr. Burton. Last week, during our committee meeting, I asked the minister if the Canada Investment Act reform would protect foreign companies who might be hostile to our interests, not only if we do Quebec or Canadian acquisitions, but we could also have public tenders in strategic places. The example of CRIC, who have qualified for renewing the Metro fleet in Toronto. However, this company has been banned in the United States. According to you, do you think we should improve the Canada Investment Act in order to forbid companies like CRRC company?
I do. And I do think that Quebec is becoming much more aware of this situation. The articles in Journal de Montréal have been really, I think, increasing the awareness of the Quebec public about the nature of the Chinese regime. And I really salute that, because I think it's important that people in Quebec should know.
Vous avez effectivement.
In fact, in your letter, as you mentioned earlier, you published an editorial in the Globe and Mail on the Technic and Core. I'd like to bring to another similar field. The company, Paper Excellence Canada, Excellence Paper Canada, or Asian Pulp and Paper, has made quick acquisitions in the forest industry, more specifically in Domtar and Resolute. Does this worry you? And if so, do you believe that certain criteria should be applied to these kinds of transactions?
Yes, I believe I was quoted in the Quebec press with the word troublant, troubling to me that this is going on. And I agree that it's part of the Chinese regime's overall scheme to use these investments to serve Chinese interests and to cause us to have too much dependency on China, which could then be used as economic coercion in political areas over things like police stations or Chinese espionage. And, you know, the Quebec universities have a very serious problem of Chinese money resulting in the transfer of dual-use technologies to China from Quebec. And Huawei, for example, is still sponsoring projects in the province of Quebec.
Donc, je pense qu'une enquête publique.
So I think a public, independent inquiry regarding China's meddling might be relevant, according to you?
More information on it, and I'd like it to be from sources that don't have a vested interest or have a perception of that they may be beholden to Chinese interests or the interests of a certain political party.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Balsillie, you took part in our study. In my mind, I think it was very important that you were in attendance regarding the management of intellectual property. You were very critical as to Canada's means of protecting and managing innovations. Do you believe that the review on the Investment Canada Act, as you mentioned in your preliminary remarks, will bring you further? Has this diminished your worries at all?
No, thank you for the question. No, the approach with the Investment Canada Act has heightened my worries that what we have to come to appreciate in this changed world is that these realms are first very technical, so they require expertise, and two, there's a linkage between IP management and research, foreign trade agreements, foreign direct investment, tax treatment, competition strategies, privacy management, democracy protection, that these forces cross-cut, and they're very technical, and Canada has experienced a systemic erosion in its realms economically and non-economically in this digital era because of this inattention. So these are links in a chain. They have to be looked at systemically. So if you falter in scientific research or you falter in appropriately updating this act or appropriately seeing trade agreements as regulatory remote control agreements, not tangible trade facilitation, then that one weak link can be exploited and it can erode the work of every other piece of legislation. So it's absolutely critical that we upgrade all systemic portion. This is not a processing issue. This is a comprehension issue and an expert systemic approach, or we will continue the erosion that we've been experiencing economically and non-economically over the past couple decades.
Est-ce que, en sens...
And in that sense, so the lack of clarity in rules in Canada with respect to intellectual property makes our assets somewhat more vulnerable with respect to national security. Could you cite some examples as to how some countries, and once again we could point to China, proceed when it comes to appropriating our intellectual property innovations?
Countries such as the United States and in Europe, when you do research that's taxpayer funded, it immediately accrues to the state to have control of it for appropriation purposes. They also have pooling structures both for their intellectual property for the benefit economically and non-economically. They also govern their data much more front-footed for public well-being, and places like Australia have broadened the scope to things like university partnerships and other things that don't address this, and they have unwinding mechanisms. And also our adversaries have controlled the information space, and we've kept ours open without rules, and therefore it's actually a strategic disadvantage to be an open Western economy in this realm absent digital rules. So we're vulnerable in pretty much every realm because of the inattention in this space over the last couple generations of policy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Monsieur Lemire, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Mr. Massé.
This is Abi here, and I think I'll start with the friends from the Canadian Bar Association and work my way across this way. I know that you have 12 committees and appreciate having two of them here. I just wondering, is the recommendations that you have, there's 6, I believe, in total. Do they come from the experience of your law firms and your clients and that and experience? Like, is that specific to, real field activity that's taking place?
I think I can say as a general matter, when we work on these policies, positions on legislative proposals, we certainly have experience in practice in this area, and we bring that to bear. But it also some of our comments are really legal concepts like protecting due process, et cetera. But certainly it's a combination, and we represent both investors, foreign investors, and we represent Canadian businesses.
Do you represent foreign governments too? Like, would you have members that represent foreign governments during acquisitions of Canadian companies?
If a foreign investor had foreign government ownership, we might represent those. Yes.
Okay. Would that concern you a little bit of a conflict of interest, I guess, at the table? I mean, that's something that you do a great. The Canadian Bar Association is well involved in a lot of different things. I don't want to misjudge you, but it sounds to me like there's a little bit of a connection here to the value of work that would happen or the process if there was changes. And
I think you would find that we have a fair bit of integrity and that we do come to you as the Canadian Bar Association, and we do try to maintain a fairly principled way of looking at legislation.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I appreciate that. I just think it's important to note, though, and I do think there's, like I say, you have 12 sections and committees. In terms of, and I'll give you an example, this is where my concern is, adequate resources. Would that be paid by the companies in acquisition, or would it be paid by Canadian taxpayers to actually do those resources?
I think that that's a bigger government question as to how funding works.
Well,
I know some things are self-funded. For example, when you make a merger notification to the Competition Bureau, you pay $82,000 per transaction, whether it's a small transaction or a big transaction. Other government functions do not have filing fees. So
okay. So you haven't taken it, because I guess my concern is this: is that, and I'm going to open this up to him, is that because if not, then you either cut services somewhere else, you either raise taxes, are the two choices that we have to create this for the foreign acquisitions of Canadian companies, and so that's something I was a little bit surprised not to see as a recommendation coming forward, because that's a tall order for Canadians to do for a process to lose their companies. And I guess I'm going to switch over the next three right here, Mr. Basili, Currack, and Burton. I'm going to bring up a case that I think is important, because I think, Mr. Basili, you mentioned with regards to a transport expert committee that would be formed, and Mr. Burton, you mentioned about Aecon Construction, and I think this is important as a good example, because I want to see what your thoughts are about this actual entity. So here's a headline from 2018 that I was mocked on by a number of different members from Windsor West MP worried China could be part of the Howe Bridge project, because Aecon Construction was building this iconic new border crossing in my riding that has basically, my riding has 40% of Canada's daily trade with the United States, and I've been working on a new bridge since 1998. And we finally got it, and Aecon Construction was up for, and I couldn't believe it, for sale at a time when we were in the actually process of building it. And it was like it was dismissed as being, this is landing in the United States. And so we raised it, and I guess I'll start with Mr. Basili and then come across here, is this committee that you're talking about, entity, how important is it? I mean, I'm talking about a pretty straightforward thing about construction of a bridge, but now we have artificial intelligence, we have critical minerals, we have other issues. So please, Mr. Basili, and then across the table, please.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I think we have to come to terms with the fact that these are cross-cutting issues, and in my earlier part of talking about data governance and IP, I did not talk about algorithmic governance, which is also highly interrelated to that and has, quite frankly, soared in its relevance. And these things are governed in our trade agreements, they're governed in privacy, they're governed in investment attraction, they're governed in competition, they're cross-cutting. And so we need an economic council with deeper expertise. We need cross-cutting approaches to these things. We need agencies with expertise and transparency. And if we do not do this, we will continue to experience this decline and erosion in the country, economic and non-economic, which you cannot deny in the past 20 years has happened, and it's a consequence of inattention to critical public policy issues.
So, yeah, China, it's big. It is doing an awful lot of investment in its capabilities, knowledge capabilities and whatnot. It's now the leading patenting country in the world. It is one of the fastest growing countries in terms of receipts for international intellectual property receipts. So it's actually now marketing its own knowledge. It is the world's largest payer for intellectual property. And in other words, it's importing technology at the biggest importer of technology in the world at a time when it's under technology sanctions, okay? And it's going to be around. Even in the area of computer chips, where it only has about 7.6% of the global market and is under a major full court press by the United States to prevent it from moving forward, it is actually moving forward gradually in terms of improving its processes. And within 5 years, it will be there. And we will have to deal with China. And so the idea that somehow we can not deal with China is a non-starter. So the question is, how do we actually define that relationship? The Europeans are talking about de-risking. So does de-risking mean that a Chinese company cannot build a bridge in Canada? Now, if it's interactive, sort of infrastructure where it's got a lot of telecommunications, data flowing, then we may have very valid concerns about which companies from which country are involved in the construction and the management of that infrastructure. If it's a physical thing in Canada, do we worry about that? So I think it really depends upon the, again, it goes back to the data and the information flow within our economy. We are moving from a world where we used to trade products, inert products across borders. Now everything's smart. And of course, the infrastructure is getting smart. So it's a very difficult thing.
Does Mr. Burton have, he can have my 2 minutes for later.
Yeah, please go ahead, Mr.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I think, certainly, while perhaps your colleagues laughed at that headline, Aecon Construction did not laugh at it, and they withdrew their bid of the Gordie Howe Bridge prior to continuing the negotiations with regard to their acquisition by a Chinese state-associated entity. So, I had expected that the government would approve the acquisition based on all of the other things that have raised earlier in this hearing, and I was pleasantly delighted when that was turned down for the reasons, I don't entirely agree with Dan here, that, it's just not a good idea for the Chinese state to have intimate knowledge of Canadian infrastructure that would be acquired through acquisition of a construction company, and those blueprints would be heading to Beijing for sure if that had happened.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think this is an interesting time right now. I know, Mr. Balsillie, for one, you were just at our Science and Technology Committee, and we're talking about IP commercialization, so owning more of what we create. And in this part, we're also trying to make sure we protect what we create. So I think I really want to zero in on some recommendations you've given the committee. Can't agree more that economic and security risks should not be analyzed separately. Certainly, we need a strategic technologies and critical technologies list like the U.S. It seems right now, I think your last recommendation was to create a CFIUS, so the Committee on Foreign Investment that the U.S. has. We do have an investment review division under ISID right now. I think one of the differences I've seen is that CFIUS is interagency, so it seems to work across many different, I guess here would be ministries, and the U.S. seems to get that. We seem to have it only under ISED, and to the point I want to zero on earlier before is you talked about, we're not talking about intangible assets, certainly not talking about data and IP, and certainly protecting that, and again, AI, as we're going to be studying with C27, is just incredibly powerful right now. We don't know what that's going to do to IP and data. So just a question of, should we be looking at maybe a recommendation to give more power to the Investment Review Division under ISID, but maybe looking at multi-ministry And how do we handle the AI component, not alone just IP and data itself?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm systemically concerned about the attention on these issues, and the AI Act has it being operated by the promoter of AI is also the regulator of AI within a ministerial discretion. There's issues where the Competition Bureau is seeking more independence. We're looking at issues for more strengthening rather than weakening the Privacy Commissioner. And then you have granting agencies under ISED that has not done any governance of the AI and data elements of it, and now you're wanting to task a bigger role of this. And what's the governance of that? What's the expertise issue? What's the resources? What's the transparency of it? Yeah, we're going to have to build expertise in the form of some kind of economic council to distill these things. We're going to have to start to create agencies with transparency and accountability on that can be called before Parliament to explain their rationale. These kind of informal, non-transparent, generalist approaches have not served Canada well in this era of the knowledge-based economy, and that erosion is going to keep happening at an increasing rate. And if we don't stop this before a tipping point, then all the issues we're seeing in polarization, economic erosion, security compromising that we've heard, and so on, bullied and trade agreements and so on, they're just going to get worse. And so it has to be a structural, systemic commitment to the expertise in a cross-cutting realm. There's just, as Einstein said, make it as simple as possible, no simpler. The character of this stuff is tricky. So don't pretend it's not. And just like don't pretend China's not going to be here. It's only going to get tougher.
Ms. Walker and Ms. Caldicott, so from a legal perspective on this, we do have the Investment Review Division, which is under ISED. So this bill, the Investment Canada Act, would then give specific instructions to this group through this bill. We're looking, I guess, for some clarity based on Mr. Basili did recommend a strategic list, which is incredibly important because Canada not only has critical assets and tangible assets and AI that we need to protect, but there's a list that I understand the Investment Review Division would have. What specifically in this bill, how would we frame this and protect it? I mean, to make the ICA prescriptive is really difficult because it takes about, if we've seen the speed of government, it would take sometimes 2 years to reopen a bill. So how do we give that prescription legally in recommendations to the Investment Review Division through the ICA so that we can have them maybe more advanced or have a complete list of critical industry technologies that we need to protect?
Kick it off. I mean, thank you for the question. So far, the ICA has operated on a legislation plus regulation track, and I think when it's come to national security and the increasing enforcement of national security under the ICA, we haven't seen legislative change. We've seen change in regulations that has stepped up enforcement in particular sectors of the economy or against particular types of investors. So that, I think, as we mentioned previously, is the flexible end of the enforcement approach that exists within that framework. Legislation, I think, as you rightly say, is a slow-moving process and isn't easily able to react to those evolving geopolitical challenges and changes in circumstances around which sectors might be sensitive or which aren't. And so I think you can lean on some of that history in terms of formulating the way in which regulations should be used in the future to address evolving national security considerations.
And just a question from a legal perspective. There's normally we look at either a minister's power, which we're not always in favor of, depending on who the minister is, or an order in council, so cabinet. Is that something you'd recommend? Maybe we be looking at order in council rather than the minister?
Well, I think regulations are made by the governor and council, which effectively is the federal cabinet. So it's not the individual minister, and it's certainly not the Investment Review Division. The other aspect. So if you figure out what you want to cover and you have a more flexible approach in regulations, the other layer on top of that is guidance from the ISED, for example, on how they're going to interpret and apply what's in the regulations and in the law. So that's another level. But in terms of the prescribed business activities, there is greater flexibility if you stick those in regs.
Thank you. MP Gahir for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for making time for the committee and for their testimony. My questions are for Mr. Balsillie. So in your opening testimony, you had mentioned that you would allow for more broader review. Now, this question was asked to Ms. Walker earlier, but I'll ask the same one to you. How do you suggest that the government strike the required balance between the protection of Canada's national security interests and IP on one side and the importance of allowing foreign investment in Canada on the other side?
Well, I think we have to revisit the nature of the flows of foreign investment, because we use an analytical framework of a production economy where it brings management, it brings technology, it brings a tax base, and it brings a supply chain, whereas in the intangible economy, it's fundamentally exfiltration, and the flows go outside of the country in that. So I think our lens of FDI, and you look at the nature of the marketing of the Investment Canada organization, we give them money to erode Canada. And so I would say in this, we have to, in value chains, there are no friends. Somebody's the landlord, somebody's the tenant. And everybody wants us to be the tenant, and everybody wants to be the landlord. So we're going to have to stand on our own 2 feet and look after our own nation by ourselves. And of course, and so in this, we need a proper analytical framework for how these things move. And then when you do that with proper expertise, you will stop doing a lot of things that you think are helpful but are in fact hurtful. Our last place in the OECD in prosperity is a function of public policy misalignment for the last several decades. Has nothing to do with business dynamism. It's been a creature of public policy, and we have to put the mirror on the right cause of it, or we're never going to fix the problem. And all of these issues are cascading very much to this committee, but also to a couple others at this time. This is a product of decades of inattention. And if we don't fix it now, you're going to see things in 10 years we're really going to not like.
So just speaking on that framework, oh, I can hear my echo. Just speaking on that framework, you had mentioned unwinding existing partnerships and giving that legislative power to Canada's Parliament. Could you expand on this and how it's been used in Australia? And couldn't that create a climate where people don't want to invest in Canada even more?
Well, if most of these relationships are fundamentally exfiltration, we spent decades creating foundational AI technology and gave it to Google. Taxpayer money created foundational battery technology in Dalhousie and gave it to Tesla. And what we get are some research papers. So taxpayers funded this. Would you like the legislative authority to unwind that? And what exactly is the FDI that we're quote unquote losing? So I think that, yes, we'll stop. We're gaining 10 cents to lose $10, and we want the option to unwind that. I kind of like that deal, and I don't like that FDI. And I think if people took the proper time to bring in experts in the analysis, they'd figure out that we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and this is not the kind of FDI that we want. And seeking this FDI is why we're last place in the OECD for the last 40 years and are forecasted to stay there for the next 40 years. And people cannot afford to pay their bills because of poor public policy. So I don't think we want this kind of FDI under these terms. Other nations put structures around these relationships to ensure that it looks after many economic and non-economic realms to advance their citizens, and our extreme neoliberalism has hurt us.
So I feel like some of the amendments. So I feel like some of the amendments that we've brought do provide some of that structure. So, for example, the bill does propose interim conditions that allow the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, after consultation with the Minister of Public Safety, to impose interim conditions on an investment. First of all, would you agree with that? And what sorts of interim conditions would you like to see during a review?
Again, I will say that one, is there the expertise to actually do this review properly, and is it done in an integrated whole? Number two, is it done in a transparent fashion so that we can be assured of where it's done, where it's accountable to Parliament? And three, is it done in the proper scope of realms that I'm trying to address? And I've mentioned data like Mr. Chiriak has, so my answer to all those is no. And again, I will restate, if we do not start rethinking our approaches, including to trade, investment, competition, democracy, privacy, AI, these are linked elements. They're for all the marbles, and our citizens will pay the price of this inattention. And the time for not taking this serious is past. And I've been here before on regulated data and AI, and we've seen the relevance of AI soar on this, and you've had people talk about this interrelationship of data and AI. I see none of this properly factored in these approaches. It's just, it's regulatory theater, and we have to come to terms with the fact that that's been our modus operandi for too long.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Balsillie.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lemire for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Schwanen, I'd like to hear you speak to the means by which we can better attract investment. Can we work on transparency, specifically when it comes to indicators that the minister could release publicly to provide accountability on the requirements that are put in place? Or should there be more transparency, let's say, in agreements in which the government invests? Should these elements be made public, for example, as was announced by Volkswagen last week? What do you think?
Oui, bah écoutez,
Yes. It depends. If we are in competition with, as you just mentioned, with the United States and whether potential players, for example, Volkswagen, there could have been an investment. There might be elements that we might wish to look at as a state, and that would apply to Quebec or Canada. That would be the same. But to not simply give this away, to give away our game. So from that point of view, I would see that if we have the right reasons but we have to explain what those reasons are. So we don't want to have to disclose everything that we've done to attract the investment. But generally speaking, and that applies to everything that's been said, I'd like us to, of course, see more robust legislation to ensure that foreign investment does not undermine our security. Nevertheless, it can be transparent with respect to the criteria that we use as a basis of our decision in identifying what poses a threat to our security, what does not. That's what I wanted to say. I'll stop here, but yes, transparency is good, but especially transparency which explains which criteria we're using to say yes or to say no. It doesn't mean that we have to disclose secrets. I'd like to hear you speak about the issue of critical and strategic minerals. Do you have a sense that the bill will be able to strengthen the protection of these minerals for Canada? Is our list detailed enough? Yes. In fact, this list, as we've just discussed, will be tied to regulations that will be published in that will enhance the list or reduce it. No doubt it'll increase. But yes, we already somewhat have the tools in hand that if we wanted to move ahead with the legislation as such, that's how I could express it. And I believe Mr. Burton said that it's all about using them. We might have woken up a little bit late in this game, but we do have the tools in hand. It's a matter of improving on them and to tighten them, to sharpen them. Thank you very much.
Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start with Mr. Burton and go across the table again real quick. I only have 2.5 minutes, so if that should be as quick as possible, 30 seconds each if possible. Just looking at the global trend, there seems to be more scrutiny on actually reviewing investment and foreign investment coming in general. And so this, I mean, some are, presenting today to weaken the bill, some to strengthen the bill. I've always thought, quite frankly, especially because we've been increasing thresholds, that has not been a good strategy for review. But I'll start with Mr. Burton across. What's if this legislation, how do you think it fits within the context of the global world and democracies and other things looking at this?
Well, I think, just to answer very briefly because of the shortness of time, Canada is much less willing to be transparent about matters relating to national security threats than, say, Britain, the U.S. and the U.K. It seems to be a cultural thing where our intelligence agencies seem to curate the information and evidently, according to Globe and Mail, share it with the Five Eyes and other intelligence agencies, but they don't inform Canadians of what's going on. And so I think, leaving aside the legislation, we just need to have a shift in culture where our intelligence agencies are more accountable, not just to the Canadian people, but to Parliament, because some of the word salad that they've been giving to parliamentary committees on matters when they're asked very simple questions distresses me enormously.
Very briefly, I think it's moving in the same direction as the Americans are in particular. There is a war going on to dominate the new critical technologies, and that war is being fought in the supply chain on stuff which normally would not be considered national security, but it becomes national security because it's part of the supply chain for a critical technology. I think we have to actually amplify our focus in that area to be consistent with the Americans, because ultimately we will be part of that security supply chain.
Is there specific focus you want? No. I'll be consistent. I'm consistent in all these committees: finance, Indu, SNR, trade. This is for all the marbles, the digital and IP realm. They operate through legal frameworks. It's causing an explosion of mental health in our children. AI algorithms. It's causing national security. It's causing an erosion of our prosperity. We have to start to take this very, very seriously. And I know we all love this country and we want the best for it. I'm trying to implore you that this is where the game is being fought by everyone right now. We have all the ability to fix it and create a very prosperous and safe future, but we have to take this very seriously.
Just very briefly on your question, I think definitely Canada is part of that trend that's going on globally. One interesting, perspective that we see collaborating with lawyers in other jurisdictions is they look at Canada with a national security regime that's existed since 2009 and say that's actually been here for quite some time. The powers have been there to intervene for for nearly 15 years. There hasn't been that much intervention, but certainly to characterize Canada as sort of not having had a national security regime probably isn't quite, it has a more mature regime than many other jurisdictions. I obviously exclude the United States from that list, but in many ways Canada is seen as I think, amongst allied countries as having had that regime for some time.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé. Monsieur Généreux.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. Mr. Généreux. Thank you. To all this is extremely interesting. Mr. Burton, what is the biggest risk facing Canada right now?
Well, I think what Mr. Balzilli said is certainly a huge risk, but that's not my area of expertise. I am concerned about our lack of response to these serious allegations of China's malfeasance and the enormous diplomatic cohort that China has here in Canada compared to other countries. They have 146 people. India has 46. Japan has 46. India has 35. I mean, we really need to get on top of this and take the necessary action. And I don't think it's that hard in terms of how we go about it. But I do think that that's the largest risk. And then, of course, we have lesser-funded hostile actors like Russia, Iran, North Korea. All of these should be constrained from engaging in activities that interfere with our democracy and society.
Do you believe that China has gone too far in threatening the members of a Canadian MP, whose existence we learned about this morning, but whose we know that the government has been aware of this for some time.
Well, I mean, you know, the Chinese regime threatens the family members in China of all people in Canada that engage in activities the Chinese government doesn't like. So the idea that they would be harassing Mr. Chong's relations in Hong Kong is not at all surprising to me. In fact, I've been aware of this for some time. But you know, we have to be, seeing as CSIS knows who the diplomats are, then I think that we send out a signal to them that emboldens them to do more of this kind of activity when we take no effective action against them. And, you know, the reports today in Journal de Montréal that the police stations are still operating is just, I just don't get it. You know, why wouldn't we be bringing those people who are engaged in illegal activities in Canada against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to be accountable in a court of law?
Monsieur Basili.
Mr. Basili?
Canada right now for the next 10 years, 20 years?
The number one threat to Canada right now is we are not properly taking control of our IP and data assets. And that includes all of the algorithms and the knowledge capital, the data capital that Mr. Chiriak's referenced. And therefore, once that goes into, we let it flow out. In fact, we let it flow out as an instrument of public policy. And I think if we don't start deliberate strategies to control that, that's what's put us in this position, and it's going to worsen at an increasing rate if we don't change our approaches.
So what's the most important thing that should be changed in that bill, particularly in that bill, or?
That? Oh, I would quickly change. I would put conditions on our research funding similar to what other nations do, that it accrues to the nation state. I would properly regulate IP and data for all of its.
But does it have to be in that bill?
In this bill here?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the nature of this bill is to assess any transaction for these effects. And therefore, when these effects are negative, you stop it. But the point is, you've got to have the expertise to assess it, like data, as we talked about, and it's got to cover the scope of activities beyond that represents the completeness of these at play.
Okay, if you put a rule in your bill, and like Australia, and you can reverse a decision that's been made or been accepted by the government, saying that the company can buy another one, and then 3 years later or 2 years later, you can, oh, no, we're going to reverse that because it's not good. Does it frighten all the companies, or is it? Have you know, or do you know if an Australian different company didn't decide not to go in Australia because of what's contained in the bill?
I think you can look at, in a very specific context, which ones you can unwind, like university research partnerships or forms of technology that have transferred that have not gone through the review process on it. So you can do this in a way that does not hurt business. And if you are costing 10 cents of business but gaining $10 of national benefit, I'll take that trade.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fillmore, pour 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, and thank you for your time and for being here. And Ms. Walker, it's nice to see you again on this topic again so soon. I'd like to direct my questions to Mr. Chiriak and Mr. Balsillie, Honorary Captain Balsillie. Nice to see you. The space I'd like to explore with you is, well, first of all, I'll say that I thank you for your comments, and I'm sympathetic to them in the context of the unimproved bill. And the place that I want to explore with you, if I could, is the concerns you've raised in the context of the proposed amendments that we have before us. So, for example, the concerns around the sharing of data or the loss of data or the use of data against Canadian interests. The ability that is proposed in this bill to allow the minister to impose interim conditions, for example. I mean, is there something here to work with? Do you feel like just to give you a little more to work with? So the let me get the right part of my highlights here. The filing the new filing requirements prior to the implementation, interim conditions, the order for further review of investments, improved information sharing with international allies. Are we starting to get to something here?
I think in terms of having at least a framework for intervention in an investment, which may have the concern, which may raise the concerns that we're talking about, that's good. The question is how you actually then wind up elaborating that regime and providing guidance to the civil servants who will be ultimately administering it. If it's just like a set of check boxes that you tick and see whether or not this fits into a category that then is kicked over into a process for an interim review, where there's another set of boxes to tick as to whether or not something happens, then the real question is, what are the labels on those boxes? Right? How do we actually implement such a regime? Do we have a framework for classifying data concerns that would then allow the minister then to intervene in a way which we've been talking about transparency, as Daniel Schwan has been emphasizing. We do need to have a framework that gives the minister a leg to stand on when making such interventions. And I don't think that we've elaborated that framework at all so far in Canada.
Yes, I would echo that. We don't have a framework that manages the appropriation regimes of both for economic and non-economic goods. So when I read the bill, I see it as we're focusing on the trees and we don't have a sense of the forest. And we just simply, when you look at the kinds of issues, the intangible economy, in the tangible production economy, if you get 90% of it right, you get 90% of the benefit. In the intangible economy, if you get 90% of it right, you get 10% of the benefit. It penalizes incompleteness non-linearly. So you need a complete framework, you need complete expertise, and you need a very sophisticated approach to that. So losing foundational battery technology when we're spending $13 billion potentially in a battery plant, wouldn't we like to participate in the value chains there so that we can capture more of the economics than assembly if we can chisel into value chains? So you just have to manage appropriation structures, whether that's for mining technology or every sector in the economy. They're all IP and data industries, and we've learned they've all got social and security effects now. So it comes down to appropriation and control of systemic factors, and I don't see the legislation coming with that lens and capacity and framework, as Mr. Chiriak said.
The challenge I think we have is that the needs are broad. The legislation is narrow at present. I mean, some of the things that you've raised are covered in other, a ministerial order here about research, and maybe the digital charter covers another piece of it. But I think it was you, Jim, that mentioned, the sort of maybe our approach is dispersed over too many departments. Someone mentioned something like that. So if I can bring this all together, then there seems to be a common feeling that some of our allies are doing this better, differently and better, more comprehensively. We seem to be facing a challenge of having it dispersed across government instead of centrally coordinated. Are the allies doing it in a way that it is centralized? Have they cracked this? Have solved this problem?
I think there's an element of dispersion. I think there's also an element of capacity and competence, and so I think until you get expert, concentrated, accountable, transparent agencies that look after this, then if it's a little bit over there, a little bit over there, then it's going to be of no force and effect, and it will be this, what I've written publicly, I consider it regulatory theater. And I do not see this bill materially changing the erosion that Canada's experiencing in these realms.
Practical question. There's been a lot of discussion about data and defining data that maybe should be covered in the bill. There's always a question about, how much detail you put in the legislation or how much detail you leave for regulation. You want flexibility enough in the legislation to allow the regulation to react to changing circumstances. Can we really define the data that is at risk through your view in legislation, or Do you have a solution to that problem?
No, I would not put it into legislation for reasons that I think Sandy Walker mentioned earlier, which is that it's much easier to change regulation and amplify regulation, and that's where you would put it. The question, I think you do need a more articulated regime than you have right now. As I said, to give the minister, who will ultimately have some discretion here at the end of the day, to intervene where needed. We are making this up as we go. So are our allies. There is no set playbook here. This is not ready for textbooks yet in terms of how you deal with this particular data-driven, knowledge-based economy with all of the negative externalities in social and political space. So what we have to do is to provide us with some flexibility. I do hearken back to my own days back in developing legislation in the financial sector, and we provided the Minister of Finance an awful lot of flexibility in discretion in terms of approving who could own a bank in Canada. And that stood us very well ultimately in the great financial crisis. We came out of that with the strongest financial sector in the world. So when times are changing, you do need flexibility, you do need discretion. That does kind of cut against transparency, but at least you tell them where you are going to be looking, and you have to give some indication of what your criteria are. But
your expectations are correct, Mr. Fillmore. You are out of time. Mr. Viss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. My mind's sort of blown up right now with all the directions I could go, but maybe getting back to basics here. Ms. Walker, how would you define investment?
I'll tell you how it's defined in the Act, if that's helpful, because investment could be very broadly defined, but in the Act, it means the establishment of a new Canadian business, and it also means an acquisition of part or whole of a Canadian business. The national security regime applies slightly more broadly, but it's still linked to the establishment of a business or an entity with links to Canada or an acquisition.
Thank you. In other laws in Canada, how is investment defined differently than that?
I've never actually looked at that question, so I don't know. But it's obviously as legislators, you have the ability to come up with a definition. The scope of the Investment Canada Act is currently really focused on those two things: establishment and acquisition.
I asked that question in the context of the points raised about the digital economy and sort of what this committee will be dealing with as well in respect to C27. Mr. Basili, you caught my attention, and I was texting with my wife during this committee about what we were talking about. And the other day I came home and my son had asked for a Paw Patrol app to be downloaded on our iPad. I don't know the origins of this application or which company owns it, but in my mind, it almost seems that a foreign company is operating in Canada. They're investing in Canadian users. They're extracting information from children as young as 2 years old. They're using that for monetary purposes, but it wouldn't be covered under the Investment Canada Act, or as Ms. Walker said, likely not another law in Canada, even though it is a form of investment to extract information and therefore wealth from Canadians at all ages. Would you agree with that type of assessment?
Yeah, and that's what Mr. Chiriok said. And it's being well documented that they're now extending these youth exposure to gaming, to pornography, and creating dysfunctional addictions at critical developmental ages. And so we're manufacturing a mental health crisis in our youth. And what society, our job is to protect our youth. And so when you look at these negative spillovers of these operations that may not be here but are participating here, it's not only security, it's not only democracy, it's many other aspects of negative spillovers of mental health as well as economic. And these kinds of mechanisms should be attuned to protect and advance our society.
I just to clarify, you're recommending that the Investment Canada Act, although it covers sort of traditional aspects of the economy that we're all aware of, mining, in some cases healthcare in British Columbia, but we extend and broaden the definition of what investment includes to protect, in this case, as you referenced and I alluded to, the mental health of children.
Well, I think when you start to look at the business operations, as Mr. Chiriak said, that really says if you are, whether you're physical or virtual here, this should be affected. And yes, that can be regulated, but also you must begin to look at things like privacy legislation and algorithmic legislation to attend to those things. And when you have trade agreements trying to shackle our ability to address these things, we now have to start to look at whether we push back on these kinds of things. So these are links in a chain, and you have to look at them systemically, but this is a powerful instrument, as is privacy and algorithms, as is all of the elements that I keep referencing, as is research partnerships and so on. So we have to start to look at these things expertly and systemically.
Right. So you alluded throughout your testimony today, and I'll ask Mr. Syriac to comment in a second, that we're at a tipping point in Canada dealing with some of these digital challenges in respect to intellectual property, Canadian sovereignty, national security. Is there any proposed amendments? Maybe you can get back to the committee a little later. In a way that we can address this in the context of C27 as well, which touches upon many of these points too. My apprehension as well, I will state, is that governments, you've mentioned that there's a capacity and context issue with the Government of Canada in this department. Can government ever really keep up with the technology that's being developed and implemented so quickly today?
100% government can keep up. Yes, you have to focus on it deliberately. I've spent the better part of a year working on predecessor C11 and C27 on the Centre for Digital Rights website. We have a 50-page set of proposed amendments to it. They can all be done properly. So yes, we will come forward with specific amendments to this bill. It all can be done. And we govern our fisheries, and what it takes to govern this realm is a subset of the resources we apply to fisheries. Not to say fisheries is unimportant, but when we decide something's important, we can put resources and expertise to it. We just haven't decided that yet as a policy community.
Okay. And to you, sir, quick, with any remaining time.
Thank you very much. So I'll go back to sort of an example from, again, financial history. One time we used to have an Inspector General of Banks, a Superintendent of Insurance, and so forth. We generalized that to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions because they were blurring. Well, now in the current context, investment, as you say, is a physical presence, okay? We do have the OECD G20 inclusive framework, which already acknowledges the virtual presence and applies a method for taxing that. So there's your starting point. We now have got to generalize into, we have an incomplete framework for regulating operations in Canada. We need to generalize our Investment Canada framework to that level, or create a separate instrument which governs the virtual presence.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today. It's a fascinating discussion, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to focus my questions to you, Mr. Balsillie, and I'd like to start with, you've spoken a lot about exfiltration, and first of all, I want to take this opportunity to say that I know over the course of years, I would say that you've tried to exfilter an NHL hockey team from the U.S. to Canada, if I'm not mistaken. And I know you haven't had success with that yet, but I'd like you to know that I'm fully in support of that, regardless of the business case behind it. So I hope you keep that up. But you've spoken about the need to bring in expertise quite a number of times during our discussion, and to help ensure that we have the expertise to inform government decisions in the areas that we've been discussing. And I guess my understanding, a couple points I want to make. First of all, my understanding is that some of the things that we've spoken about, not necessarily you, but some of the other folks in the panel, things like research security or IP protections are covered in many cases under other regulations or other legislation. There was just a discussion about the protection of children and privacy laws, and we've had a bill introduced just in January on that matter. So what I'm trying to do is highlight that this bill isn't meant to solve all the problems that have been discussed today, but it's meant to solve some of them, and some of the other problems are being tackled to some degree or another in other bills. But I want to come back to your point about expertise, because you've repeated it several times, and I hear you. And you've talked about the different components of the value chain and how easy, especially it is in the digital space or in AI, for the value to leak or exfilter, as you said. And one of the things that I want to ask you is, if the minister had the expertise that you believe he needed to have at his disposal, whatever that is, do you believe this bill would allow us to achieve the goal of preventing that exfiltration that you've been talking about?
It would take us a long way there. But I think it's most important to understand that the world changed about 30 years ago. We liberalized the tangible production economy, and Canada stopped there. We took on neoliberalism all the way, and the intangible economy works opposite. And so it's a very hands-on world with expertise. And so we disassembled our economic council in this era when the rest of the world was doubling down on their equivalent economic councils. So we've lost a capacity gap. We didn't have it there. So to be very specific, yes, we need this expertise in the industry, but we need it cross-cutting across all ministries, because these issues touch, every one of these issues touch multiple ministers at the same time. So if you want to make industry the super ministry on top of all others, that's fine. Reorganize government. Or do you want to make this a core competency that you feed into the cabinet and to the civil service? That's an organizational thing which I've had considerable engagement in. I just think we just go back and do what we restart a bit what we had before, akin to what I've seen in other nations, which is some deep level of expertise to advise into these kinds of realms. And it's been absent. And it's so needed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And look, I mean, I used to be a management consultant with BCG, and we used to spend a lot of time looking at various countries around the world and how they manage some of their sensitive industries, at least for economic value. And so your point about the 10 cents and the $1, I hear that point that you made earlier, and the batteries, et cetera. Battery technology, et cetera. I guess I'm wondering, that expertise that you're talking about, whether it's within one ministry or across ministries, however we would structure that. I guess my question is that something you would see legislating in this bill? Is that a change to this bill? Or is that a suggestion to government to act on to make sure that when this bill is passed, in whatever form it is, that we have the expertise to be able to effectively enforce what's in this bill?
I think you need both. I think the expertise is a needed piece, but I think you need to pair it with the kind of agency that would look at this and would feed into any kinds of decisions. So I think it has to be pulled out and dealt with as its own being, and I think you need to have expert analysis for all of these cross-cutting files, be it, I mean, I've mentioned many of them before, and the intangibles economy works on legal frameworks, and it's a hands-on economy as opposed to a neoliberal hands-off tangible production economy. So it's a completely different toolkit. I think we have to build the capacity broadly, narrowly and specifically, and we have to create the kind of legislative and agency powers to deal with this. And so, yeah, if you built this capacity that wherever this resides in the government, it has to reference to it, that's a step forward. If you expand the scope of this to deal with the broader kinds of places that I've mentioned, and including having the reversibility of partnerships, that's great too. But I've seen so many things, like ISED's been financing Huawei through the granting agencies. People adore Sidewalk Toronto. They let the Tesla battery technology go. Money goes to Invest Canada agency to say, come take our best stuff. So this whole system makes me very, very nervous. So we have to break with the past. It's a bit systemic, whether it's within ISED or outside of ISED. That's an important question, but I've seen the quality of Bill C-27, and it's so foundationally flawed that it doesn't give me confidence.
I think my time is up, so I appreciate your time, and I wish you luck with that exfiltration project I was talking about earlier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. Monsieur Le Maire, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Balsillie, I'd like to come back one last time to the issue that is between the inadequate protection of IP and innovation issues in the long term in Canada, as we're seeing. This might also lead to a situation where the tech champions leave the country or will set up shop elsewhere. The new ICA and the current bill will not address the issue of thresholds. According to you, is it a mistake not to have minimum acquisition thresholds? And what impact would this have on the marketing in Canada? Is anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I mean, I do not think when something is strategic that the thresholds is the appropriate lens, because everything is dual use. And so it's arbitrary. Something could be $10 million, but extraordinarily strategic for its negative consequences on our security of data or our positive security on a critical piece of creating a vaccine. So I do not think of a value. I think you have to go at your strategic technologies comprehensively. I think you have to have expertise to assess the spillovers comprehensively. I think you have to have the ability to unwind things. I think we can learn a lot from CFIUS. I think we can learn a lot from what the Australians have done. I think we can learn a lot on the expert research capacities akin to an economic council that others have done. And then how we implement it in the Canadian framework, whether it's through the Investment Canada Act or through a reconfigured agency, the stakes have become much, much higher in this realm and much, much more complex than they used to be. The simple spillover structures of the past, the CD Howe, branch plant stuff that served us so well, that doesn't serve us the same way anymore. Sometimes a branch plant is positive, sometimes it's negative. So we have to build the right tools for the state that's at hand. And I think what's so critical here is that this realm has crossed over to security much more than it used to. It's also crossed over to social much more than it used to. Whether it's weaponizing misinformation, whether it's undermining the mental health of our children, whether it's polarizing vulnerable communities, we're not governing for this now. So where does this get looked after in Canada? And that's why you're hearing a fair bit of resonance here on the nature of the problem. There are many ways you can approach addressing it, but you have to acknowledge the problem and say, is our approach sufficient to do that? It could be done within a ministry or it could be done in different ways. I'm not absolute on it, but I don't see this current approach addressing the problem we have before us.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être...
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Mr. Sirik, I was watching you respond. Would you like to make an additional comment on this issue?
Well, I guess, first of all, in terms of the overall framework, I mentioned that there is the issue of sort of the incompleteness, right? And we do have the basis for starting to develop that framework. I would note, for example, in areas where other countries have kicked out applications because they are inconsistent with their national security concerns. China kicked out Google, for example. So if a company is here making money and is actually shaping your culture, we do have an area of regulation which deals with culture, but that is a gap there. So that's one thing. In terms of the overall business model, and in terms of actually sort of dealing with the regulation, I would point you to the highly detailed operational guidelines which exist in the trade realm. The Canada Border Services Agency and the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, they have got extraordinarily detailed guidelines for how to administer those acts. And so we are nowhere near having started the development of similar guidelines to deal with data. So I would be happy if we had a 200-page thick document which had cited examples of how we dealt with that issue, with this issue, with whatever issue, to provide guidance to our civil servants in implementing a data regulatory framework.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Balsillie, you mentioned about supply chains, and that's important. I'll give an example. I know we're focusing right now here on China and other things. But I mean, even the Inflation Reduction Act. In my neck of the woods, we've already seen some tool and die mold manufacturers, Canadian companies, having to offshore some work to take advantage of making quota laws in the United States. So if we lose some of these supply chains, it's going to have in a rot. So even though we're looking at China here, what are your thoughts on that issue? I know it's a little bit separate, but to me, it's like a more mature discussion about the Investment Canada Act. We just can't assume that U.S. is our friend on these things. I've been enough times as Canada-U.S. Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Association, softwood lumber, everything else. But now what I'm worried about is Canadian companies getting hollowed out within because they have to offshore some contracts to the United States to be actually capable of sending their products into the United States in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. is mercantilist in its trade policies, and I know several companies that have had to move to the United States from Canada because they cannot access the programs they want. Also, the U.S. has become mercantilist in its tax policy for IP, creating patent boxes. So companies are saying, maybe I'll just move up my IP from Canada to the U.S. because it's half the tax rate or something like that for this, and a board has to look at that. So, yeah, we have, I mean, this has become a mercantilist world, and we have to assess. But if you have a production product where you control a piece of value chain and it's hard to move it because of you own something that cannot be replicated, then you've got leverage in the game. And so we have to start thinking much more strategically about that, or look at places where we can defend, and some of them we can't. So it's a much more dangerous world. I don't believe in this frame of friendshoring. It sounds nice, but it's reshoring in the U.S., and we're trying to pretend that it's friendshoring, and there are no friends in value chains.
It's even worse than that. I'm running out of time, but I'll give you a quick example for the committee too. Is Windsor Salt was bought by an American hedge fund, and so our own natural resources right now are locked out through a strike because they're union busters. Canyon Industries, who's also bought an Alberta firm and closed them down, and also monopolized the market salt in the United States. So it's a serious issue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Massé, and we'll conclude this discussion like we started it with Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe we can try and keep it short. I'll try and keep it short. Dr. Burton, there is no change proposed in Bill C-34 to the definition of a state-owned enterprise in the Investment Canada Act. Should that be tightened up or expanded or improved?
Well, I know that the Investment Canada Act does refer to acting under the influence, directly or indirectly, of such a government or agency. So I feel that does cover what I'm talking about. The question is, and you yourself referred to a firm as partly state-owned. None of those firms that are associated with China are outside of the Chinese regime. So I think there just has to be a recognition that when you're dealing with some countries that have that particular system that's utterly incompatible with our own in terms of a civil space and a state space and a societal space, that they all should be considered state-owned. Or at least state. Maybe we should change the definition to
even the 11 subsidiaries of Glencore that operate in China as investment vehicles into Africa.
I'd be concerned about that. I think anything that touches on the Chinese regime, if I would say in general, I think we just need to be more aware of national security implications for all sorts of things. I mean, children are not don't have any concern for national security with regard to TikTok. But, maybe Mr. Basili has some good thoughts on that. Or universities, want to do the dissemination and creation of knowledge. They don't regard national security as within their mandate. I think this has to change. It's an awareness question. So when you talk about changing the language, yes, I think changing the language. What we really need to do is what Jim has been saying, which is change the awareness of the seriousness of these matters and address them accordingly.
Well, that's a good segue, Mr. Basili. One of the things the bill does not do is it does not propose automatic reviews of acquisitions of company assets, plants, mines, land, IP, data by a company that is owned by a state-owned enterprise. Should that be put in the bill as a restriction?
Yes. Yes, and I think it all should, yes, everything should, you have to think of these things much more strategically, even if, but I also said the counterparty may not be a dangerous counterparty, but what's being exfiltrated is strategic to the country. So we could lose control of a vaccine ingredient to a friendly country, but we lose our sovereignty. So it's not just, the security lens is not just the adversarialness of the other party, though that's a material aspect. It's broader than that, which is what I think, what I've been saying, I think others have been trying to say.
Doesn't contemplate review of any portion of an asset, owning companies, and that's
correct. Yes,
that's an issue. And in the world that we live in today, with the assets being tangible and intangible, that's an area. And because ministers have not used the powers they have in the past, do you not think that we need to be more prescriptive in the act of what absolutely has to go through, since the government hasn't always used the tools at their disposal?
Yeah, well, there's a place for prescription, but also when you pull it out into an expert agency, you tend to get somebody who's quite accountable to that and takes it in a very specific lens. It's very difficult when you're a minister who's trying to juggle many things and trying to promote things, but also regulate. It's a difficult place to put themselves in, but I would argue don't put
on it a lot more than we do in the opposition to go through these things. Recommendation 8 of the Industry Committee report from the last Parliament said the other area that we should look at is that isn't included in the Act now is when a Canadian company or asset is acquired by a foreign entity that's not hostile to Canada, and then that company is ultimately bought by a hostile player. A lot of jurisdictions have the ability to go back and look at that asset and demand that it be devolved as part of that acquisition. What are your views on that? And Dr. Barton as well, if you have a choice. But start with Mr. Basile.
Yeah, of course. We have to have a lens to look after ourselves in a difficult world. If the deal changes the circumstances of the original one, of course.
Dr. Barton?
I absolutely agree with Mr. Basile on this point, and I think that is part of the Chinese strategy to evade our regulations, is to come in through different kinds of maybe sneaky means to get in there, and that is, I think there are a lot of examples of this kind of thing, particularly in third world nations.
If you could share us with some of the other jurisdictions, but also in your opening remarks, you referred to some examples that we should be considering. Could you actually table those examples with the committee? So
yes, I will.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perkins, and that concludes the 2 hours we had for this meeting. Thank you to all of our witnesses today for sharing your perspective. It's much appreciated. Merci aux interprètes, au personnel de soutien.
Thank you, the interpreters, the staff, our clerics. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Merci. No problem.